The sky over Dakota Territory on the morning of October the 14th, 1887, was the color of an old wound. Not gray exactly and not white. Something between the two, the color of a thing that has been healing for a long time and has not quite finished. The clouds sat low and unmoving over the plains, pressed down against the earth, as though the weight of what was about to happen had bent even the weather toward the ground. Wyatt had been standing in the square for 11 minutes before Harlan Stroud began to speak. She had counted the minutes because counting was something to do. Because if you were counting, you were not looking at the faces of the people arranged in a loose half circle in front of you, people whose faces you had been reading for 2 years, people whose particular expressions you had learned to translate the way you learn a foreign language, slowly at first and then all at once. She knew what those faces meant when they were being kind, which was rare. She knew what they meant when they were being indifferent, which was common. And she knew what they meant now, which was something she did not have a word for in their language, but had a word for in the one her grandmother had given her, a word that meant the expression a person makes when they have already made a decision and are now waiting for the world to catch up. 11 minutes of that expression on every face. 11 minutes of standing in dirt that had gone hard as brick with the first real cold in the thin wool dress that the settlement's women had given her when she arrived 2 autumns ago, which had been too large for her then and fit her now, which was the only measurable proof that 2 years had in fact passed and had not simply been a long, bad dream. She was still inside. Harlan Stroud did not look at her when he spoke. That was the detail she would carry. Not the words which she had already understood before he found them. Not the faces of the people around her which had already told her everything. The detail she would carry was this Harlan Stroud who had built every cabin in Providence Creek with his own 2 hands, who had shaped timber and stone and mud into the solid angular structures that lined the settlement's single road, who had stood in front of rooms full of frightened people on 3 separate occasions since Wyatt had been among them, and had spoken with the authority of a man who understood that the world responds to certainty. This man could not look at her when he delivered his sentence. He looked at the sky instead. He addressed the low gray clouds as though they were a judge he was petitioning, as though the decision had been made somewhere above him, and he was simply the instrument of its delivery, as though this absolved him of the particular weight of standing in front of a 14-year-old girl and telling her that the community had decided she was a cost it could no longer afford to carry. His voice was flat, devoid of the particular music that enters a voice when the person speaking has any uncertainty about what they are saying. He had decided. He had convinced the others. The harvest had failed for the 3rd consecutive year. The potatoes blighted the corn, shriveled on the stalk, the root cellar holding a fraction of what the settlement needed to carry its people through a Dakota winter. There was arithmetic involved, and Harlan Stroud understood arithmetic the way he understood timber, which was to say, with a completeness that left no room for sentiment. She was not family to anyone. She had no kin to claim her, no parents to advocate for her share, no grandparent with a hand on a shoulder and a voice in the council. She was the last remnant of the sky folk, the nomadic people who had understood this land before any of the settlers had arrived to rename it, who had perished 2 winters prior from the coughing sickness that had moved through their camp with the indifference of weather. All of them, every one, except for the girl who had survived by some combination of constitution and the particular stubbornness of the young, who had been found alone and brought to Providence Creek out of the reluctant charity that the settlers called Christian duty, and that Wyatt had always understood as something more complicated than either of those words. That charity had lasted 2 years. It had now run out. "She is of the wild," Harlan said to the clouds above him. "Let the wild test her. If she has the strength of her people, she will see the spring." The last 5 words carried the particular cruelty of hope applied to a situation that had none. If she has the strength of her people. Her people were dead. Her people were in the cold ground 2 valleys east of here, buried by settlers who had felt it was the decent thing to do, buried with the efficiency of people who understood that death in a Dakota winter requires speed. The strength of her people had not saved her people. The strength of her people was a memory now, and it lived entirely in the mind of a 14-year-old girl standing in hardened dirt, while the man who had built every shelter in this settlement looked at the sky and told her she was on her own. Nobody spoke after he finished. The faces in the half circle did not change. This was the expression that meant the decision had been made, and the making of it was now in the past, and the past is a country you cannot return to, and there was nothing left to do but disperse and go back to the particular anxious business of surviving a Dakota winter with not enough of anything. They turned away from her in a motion that was not coordinated but felt coordinated, the organic agreement of a group of people who have decided that the hardest part is looking, and that not looking is therefore the merciful choice. Waya stood in the square and watched them go. She felt the cold in her lungs with every breath, that particular bite of late October air, at elevation air that had been making promises all month and was now beginning to keep them. The wind came from the north in brief, strong pulses, the way a conversation comes in bursts when the person speaking is thinking hard. Each pulse carried the smell of what was coming. Snow, distance, the particular emptiness of a land that does not require you and has never pretended otherwise. She stood there after the last person had gone back inside, after the last door had closed, after the last thin plume of chimney smoke had confirmed that every hearth in Providence Creek was lit and warming the people it was supposed to warm. She stood there long enough to understand what she was feeling. It was not grief. Grief was for things you had lost. She had lost her people 2 years ago, and that was grief, the real kind, the kind that rearranged the architecture of your interior world so thoroughly that you spent months afterward bumping into walls that were no longer there and stepping through doorways that no longer led anywhere. This was not that. This was something simpler and in some ways harder. This was the end of pretending. The end of the 2-year exercise in being someone that this settlement could tolerate the careful daily performance of smallness and usefulness and gratitude. The end of making herself invisible enough to earn the right to remain. There was a clarity in it. She turned her face toward the north and felt the wind come. Grandmother Flint had told her once, in the way she told everything which was sideways, which was through the corner of the mouth rather than head on, that the world would try to break her. It will use its fist, her grandmother had said, but you are not made of stone to be broken. You are made of water. You can freeze. You can flow. You can rise as mist. Find the shape that fits the moment. Waya had been 7 years old when she first heard those words and had not understood them. She had been 12 when she began to understand them in theory. She was 14 now, standing in the hardened dirt of Providence Creek, with every door behind her closed, and she understood them in the only way that words like that can finally be understood, which is in the body, which is not through thought, but through necessity. She was water. She would find the shape that fit the moment. She walked north. She did not return to the small lean-to at the edge of the settlement, where she had slept for 2 years, did not collect the few objects she had accumulated. The extra pair of wool stockings, the small iron comb, the piece of dyed cloth she had kept, because the color reminded her of something she could not name precisely. She walked north because north was where she was going, and stopping to collect things would have meant acknowledging that the thing that was happening was the kind of thing you prepared for, and she was not ready to acknowledge that yet. Walking was the only available action, and so she walked. She was 300 yards from the settlement, past the last fence post, past the last visible mark of human organization on the land, when she heard the sound. A door. One door opened and closed very quickly, as though someone had stepped out to do something specific and had done it and had stepped back inside before they could be seen. She did not turn around. She walked for another half-mile before she allowed herself to stop and look back. Providence Creek was already small in the distance, its angular lines softened by the pale light, its chimneys releasing their thin signals of warmth into the colorless sky bomb. She looked at it for a long time, not with longing, with the particular attention of someone who is memorizing something they do not expect to need, but carry anyway, the way you carry a tool you don't know how you'll use. Then she turned and walked north again. The first night was the kind of cold that reminds you what your body actually is, which is warm on the inside and thin on the outside, a fragile arrangement of heat wrapped in the minimum possible barrier against a world that is mostly not warm at all. She found a depression in the ground near a stand of cottonwoods where the wind was partially blocked, and she pushed dead leaves into the hollow, and she burrowed into the leaves, and she pulled more leaves over herself and lay very still. She shivered for most of the night, not with fear, though fear was present, a cold animal thing that lived in the back of the throat and required regular management. She shivered because her body was doing what bodies do, which is to spend its resources on the problems immediately in front of it and the problem immediately in front of it was temperature. She let the shivering happen. She did not fight it. Grandmother Flint had taught her that shivering was not weakness, but intelligence, the body's way of generating heat through movement when it had no other source. Fighting it was fighting your own best defense. She thought about Grandmother Flint through the long, dark hours, not in a sentimental way, not with the soft, focused quality that grief sometimes gives to the dead. She thought about her practically the way you consult a reference you have memorized. What had she said about water in the cold season? What had she said about the behavior of snow when it was wet versus when it was dry? What had she said about the places where the wind moved fastest and the places where the wind was quiet and what the difference meant? She went through it methodically, cataloging, arranging in order the way you arrange tools before a job. When the first gray light came, she was still alive. She noted this without celebration. Being alive was the baseline. Everything else was information. She ate frozen berries she found still clinging to bushes in a sheltered gully, translucent and tasteless from the cold. But food, a category of things she was now calculating, in units she had never had to think about before. How much? How many days? What else was available in the landscape between where she was and wherever she was going? She found water by chipping ice from a frozen stream with a stone and holding the chips in her mouth until they melted. The first mouthful was painfully cold. The second was less so. By the third, she had established a rhythm: chip and hold, and swallow, chip and hold, and swallow, the way you establish a rhythm for any repetitive necessary task. Under the bark of the cottonwoods, if you knew where to look and how to look, there were small, clustered insects in dormancy, their metabolism slowed to near nothing by the cold, waiting for a warmth that would not come for months. She found them with her fingernails, scraping carefully, and she ate them. This was not disgusting to her. This was simply the next category of available food, and she was taking a practical survey of available categories. On the second day, the wind shifted. It came from the northwest instead of the north, and the quality of it changed, became less sharp and more weighted, the way a conversation becomes heavier when the person speaking has something significant to say. She stopped walking and stood still and put her face into it and read it. Grandmother Flint had taught her how to read wind the way the settler women read their almanacs, which was to say, with a combination of accumulated knowledge and the specific attentiveness that comes from understanding that the information matters. The wind from the northwest carried moisture. It carried the smell of elevation of high country where the snow was already deep and was preparing to move south. It carried the smell of what her grandmother had called building snow. Not yet, but soon. She kept moving north. The settlement's trappers saw her on the fourth day. She was working in the open on the face of a long, low drift in the area the settlers called Wolf's Jaw, because the ridge lines on either side curved toward each other like the upper and lower mandible of something that had been open a very long time and had not yet decided whether to close. She was working with a large flat piece of slate she had found in the creek bed, using its edge to cut and its flat face to carry, and the thing she was cutting and carrying was snow. She heard the trappers before she saw them, the particular crunch of snowshoes that has a different rhythm from the crunch of regular boots, and she kept working, because stopping would have required explaining herself to people she did not want to explain herself to. They stopped at a distance and watched. She could feel the watching. It had a particular quality, the watching of people who are witnessing something they have decided in advance they do not understand and are looking now to confirm their pre-existing conclusion. They watched for several minutes, then they went on. She kept cutting blocks. The news traveled back to Providence Creek in the way that news travels in small settlements in winter, which is fast and with elaboration. By the time the trapper's account had been heard and repeated and discussed around 3 different hearths, the story had acquired details and interpretations that had not been present in the original observation. "She's cutting blocks of ice," one man had said, "building a little house out of it." That was what he had seen. What Providence Creek heard was the thing underneath the observation, the interpretation that fit the framework of everything they believed about cold and shelter and survival. They heard a girl who has lost her mind is making her own coffin out of the thing that will kill her. It spread as a story about tragedy. The women murmured it to each other with a particular tone reserved for things that are sad but not immediately actionable. The men discussed it with the blunt fatalism of people who understand that the frontier is not sentimental, and that the ending of this particular story was predictable enough that discussing it at length was almost indecent. They called it Waya's folly, not with malice, with the resigned certainty of people who have survived long enough in a hard place to believe they understand the fundamental laws of survival and who are watching someone break those laws in real time. Harlan Stroud heard the account from the first trapper the evening he returned, and he sat with it for a long time before the fire in his own hearth, which was burning well, which was eating through his woodpile at a rate that he was tracking with a precision he had not previously applied to this particular variable. Clem, his son, 12 years old, sat across the room on the sleeping bench, carving a small piece of pine with a knife that was slightly too big for his hand and had been since the summer and would be the right size for his hand by spring if he kept growing the way he had been. "What's Waya building?" Clem asked. Harlan looked at the fire. "She's not building anything," he said. "She's lost her bearings." Clem thought about this. Why would she build something if she wanted to die? Harlan did not answer. He sat with the fire and the question for a long time after Clem was asleep. The building snow came in the first week of November. It arrived at night, a heavy, wet, sustained fall that laid itself across the landscape with the thoroughness of something that intended to stay. When Waya emerged from the shallow snow burrow she had been sleeping in and stood upright in the early morning light, the world was transformed. The drifts at Wolf's Jaw, already substantial from the earlier season, had grown by another 3 feet, and the new snow on top was exactly what she had been waiting for. She pressed her palm into it. It held the impression perfectly, the lines of her palm, the 4 separate impressions of her fingers, the smaller print of her thumb. It was wet enough to bind and dense enough to bear weight. It was the snow her grandmother had called the best snow, the snow that built things, the snow that understood what it was for. She began. Her only tool was the flat piece of slate, and the slate was clumsy and chipped at one corner and required managing at a particular angle to do what she needed it to do. Her hands were raw and chapped and burned with the specific pain of cold that has moved past the stage of numbness and into the stage of constant low fire. Her muscles, which were the muscles of a 14-year-old girl who had been eating inadequately for 10 days, screamed at the weight of each block. She cut, and she carried, and she placed. She was not building quickly. She was building correctly, which was different, and in the end more important. Each block had to be the right size, and the size was not arbitrary, but determined by the physics of the curve. She was building toward the catenary arch that Grandmother Flint had traced in the air with one finger on a winter evening years ago. This shape, this exact curve, because this is the shape that holds itself, that does not require anything from the outside to remain standing, that transfers the force of gravity through itself and into the ground rather than accumulating it in any one place. Her grandmother had understood geometry the way she understood everything, which was through the body, through the hands, through the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who had been solving this particular problem. How to be warm in a land that was not warm for longer than anyone had been keeping written records. The first course of blocks was the hardest. The ground was uneven, and she spent the better part of a morning adjusting and trimming and leveling until the foundation was right, because the foundation determined everything that came after it, and Grandmother Flint had been very clear on this point. "You begin with the ground beneath you," she had said. "If the ground is wrong, everything above it is wrong." By midday, the first course was set. By the following midday, the second course was up, and she could see the beginnings of the curve, the way the blocks angled slightly inward as they rose, the whole structure already beginning to move toward its conclusion, the way a story moves toward its ending, each piece determining and being determined by the pieces around it. The settlers' trappers came again on the 5th day and stood at their distance and watched. She was 3 courses up now, and the shape was unmistakable. Not a wall, not a windbreak, but a structure that was closing on itself, curving inward, with each course rising and narrowing simultaneously, moving toward the single point at the top where the last block would be placed and the thing would be complete. The trappers watched for longer this time. She heard one of them say something to the other in a low voice. She heard the word crazy, not with viciousness, but with the specific sadness of people who believe they are watching something inevitable. She kept cutting. She was not thinking about what they thought. She was thinking about the block in her hands, its weight and its edges, and the exact angle at which it needed to be placed. She was thinking about Grandmother Flint's voice in her memory, which was not a comforting presence in the way that memory is sometimes comforting, soft and warm, and retrospective. It was a working presence, a practical voice giving practical information, and she used it the way you use a tool for the specific task in front of her. The account that reached Providence Creek this time was longer and more confused than the first. "She's getting somewhere with it," one of the trappers reported, shaking his head. "The thing's got walls now, curves in at the top. I don't know what to call it." There was a silence around the hearth. "She's building an igloo," a woman said quietly. Her voice had an unusual quality. She had read about such things, had encountered the word and the concept in a printed account she had carried west in her trunk, but she had never seen one and was not certain her description was accurate. "The round snow houses," she said. "Some of the northern peoples build them." Another silence. "Then it won't be enough. You can't live in a house made of the very thing that'll kill you." There were murmurs of agreement. "She'll freeze to death in her own folly." Harlan Stroud sat in the corner of the room and said nothing. He was thinking about something he didn't have words for yet, a discomfort that was not quite guilt and not quite doubt, something that lived in the space between certainty and the first small crack in certainty. He did not go that day. He did not go the following day either. He went on the 8th day, which was the day after the second trapper came back with a report that the structure was nearly complete and was something none of them had a reference point for, a strange white shell rising from the prairie that bore no resemblance to any shelter any of them had built or seen or conceived of. He saddled his horse in the early morning and rode north. The air at Wolf's Jaw was different from the air around the settlement. Quieter in a way that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something more fundamental, the specific quality of silence in a landscape that has accepted winter completely and is no longer in any kind of negotiation with it. The drifts rose in long, sculpted curves shaped by the wind into forms that had a beauty Harlan was not in the habit of describing as beautiful, but which registered on him in a physical way. He found her on the east face of the largest drift. He had been prepared for what he might find, which was a partially built structure and a girl in worse shape than she had been at the settlement, thinner, colder, showing the specific signs of a body that is being used faster than it can replenish itself. He had prepared himself for the practical conversation that might need to happen, in which he offered her the corner of a barn, which was not nothing, which was walls and a roof, and the body heat of animals, which was survivable if you had enough blankets. What he was not prepared for was what he found. She was fitting a block into the rising curved wall of the structure with the precise, unhurried movements of a craftsman who knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it. The structure itself was nearly complete, a dome that rose to perhaps 5 feet at its highest point, smooth and white, and curved with a consistency that Harlan, who had been building things his whole life, recognized immediately as intentional. You do not get a curve that consistent by accident. You get it by understanding exactly what shape you're building toward and executing it block by block with a precision that leaves no room for approximation. He sat on his horse for a moment and looked at it. Then he dismounted and walked toward her, his heavy boots breaking through the surface crust of the snow with each step. She did not look up. "Child," he said. She kept working. She was trimming the edge of the block she had just placed, scraping with the piece of slate at the seam between the new block and the previous one, and the motion was practiced and efficient and spoke of having done this thing many times. "What do you think you're doing?" She did not stop moving. She finished the trim, ran her hand along the seam, and without turning, she said, "I am building my house." Harlan looked at the structure. He had built every cabin in Providence Creek. He knew houses the way he knew his own hands, which was completely and without any residual uncertainty. He knew what made a house work and what made a house fail, and he knew from the foundational principle of everything he had ever built that what made a house work was the separation of inside from outside, the creation of a warm interior, and the maintenance of that warmth against the relentless pressure of cold trying to get in. "That is not a house," he said. His voice had the weight of a man who has spent his life being certain and who is now in the presence of something that challenges that certainty and is responding by being more certain. "It is a tomb." She paused. She turned and looked at him for the first time since he arrived. Her face was thin. Her cheeks had a hollowness that had not been there in the settlement. Her hands, he could see from where he stood, were raw and chapped, and had been bleeding at some point, the dried, reddish marks of cold-cracked skin. Her dark eyes were not the eyes of a girl who is losing. They were the eyes of someone in the middle of a project and mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. "I am not fighting the cold," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely level. "I am asking it to be my shield." Harlan shook his head. He felt the frustration of someone who is watching someone make a preventable error and cannot prevent it because the person making it will not listen. "This is madness," he said. "There is still time. Come back with me. We will find a corner in the barn. It will be warmer than the ground, and it is better than this. This is suicide." She had turned back to her wall before he finished speaking. "You see snow as the enemy," she said. Her voice was patient, not indulgent, not condescending, but the patience of someone who has thought carefully about a thing and is now sharing the result of that thinking. "My grandmother taught me that the enemy's coat can be your own blanket if you know how to wear it." She placed the next block and trimmed its edge. "You build with wood," she continued. "Wood holds the memory of warmth, but it lets the wind drink it away. I will build with snow, which holds the memory of cold and teaches the wind to be quiet." Harlan stood in the cold and looked at this girl and felt the particular helplessness of a man who has lived by a principle long enough that the principle has become the man who cannot find the seam between himself and his certainty, because there is no seam, who is now being told by a 14-year-old that his certainty might be wrong. He was not ready for that. "There is still time," he said again, but this time his voice had less weight in it. She did not answer. He stood there for a while longer, long enough to feel the cold working through his coat in the specific way it works when you are standing still in a Dakota wind. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode south. He did not look back, but he was thinking about what she had said, about the enemy's coat, about the wind being taught to be quiet, about the difference between fighting a thing and understanding a thing, which was a distinction he had never applied to winter before, because applying it required admitting that his 30 years of fighting winter with fire and wood and brute force had been something other than the optimal approach. He was not ready to admit that. Not yet. What Wyatt did not know, and what she would not know for several weeks, was that he had left something at the door of her lean-to the morning of her exile. He had done it in the dark before the settlement was awake, before he could be seen. Not because he was ashamed of the impulse, but because he understood that being seen doing it would complicate the decision he had already made and communicated and could not now unmake without losing something he did not know how to lose. A knife, small, good steel, wrapped in a piece of deer hide that had been tanned by his own hand. She had found it when she went to collect herself before leaving, and had understood immediately who had left it and why. Not kindness, not redemption. The specific act of a man who has made a hard decision and cannot live with the full weight of it, and so takes one small action to reduce the weight by the smallest possible amount, enough to sleep, not enough to actually change anything. She had taken the knife. She was using it now to trim the blocks where the slate left too rough an edge, where the seam needed to be precise. The knife Harlan had given her was making his worst fear impossible to achieve. The knife Harlan had given her was part of the reason the structure rising from the face of the wolf's jaw drift was as well made as it was. She did not think about this with irony. She thought about it practically. A tool is a tool. A knife is a knife. You use what you have. The dome was complete on the 10th day. She placed the last block from inside, which was the way it had to be done, guiding it into the aperture at the top with both hands and pressing it gently into the space it had been shaped for. And when it settled into place, the whole structure gave a small sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a sigh, but was something between the two. The sound of a thing that has been built correctly and is now at rest in its own integrity. She sat in the dark for a moment and let the silence happen. Then she began the next phase. She excavated the entrance tunnel, digging down and inward, from the base of the structure, sloping it so that it descended before it rose again, creating the cold trap that Grandmother Flint had explained to her years ago, with a patience that was the patience of a woman who understood she was transmitting something that needed to survive beyond her own body. Cold air is heavy, her grandmother had said. It sinks. It pools at the bottom of things. If you build your door so that it goes down before it goes up, the cold air that wanders in will pool at the bottom of the tunnel and go no further. It will not climb into your house. Your warm air will sit above it safe. The settlers, Awaya understood, built their doors at the same level as their floors, and then spent all winter wondering why the cold kept getting in. She smoothed the walls of the tunnel. She created the sleeping platform inside the main dome, a raised bench of compacted snow along the back wall higher than the floor by 18 inches high enough to be in the warmest layer of air in the dome, the layer where the heat collected before it could find any way out. She shaped it flat and covered it with the bark she had stripped and dried in the days before the building snow came. Then she addressed the ventilation. She used a thin pointed bone she had found in the frozen grass near the creek, and she pushed it carefully through the dome at its highest point, angling it toward the outside, creating a hole no larger than her fist. She tested it with her breath, watched the small cloud of vapor move toward the hole and disappear. Good. It was working. The settlers would have looked at this hole and called it a mistake. You do not make holes in your shelter. You fill holes in your shelter. Every winter in Providence Creek was a war against holes, against the gaps that the cold found and used against the cracks that appeared in the chinking and had to be repaired before the cold turned them into something worse. But Waya was not trying to seal her home against the world. She was trying to make her home breathe. A sealed space fills with the carbon from your own breath. It fills with moisture from your own body. Without the small, steady exchange that the ventilation hole allowed, the interior air would have slowly become its own kind of trap. The hole was not a weakness. It was the thing that made everything else possible. She had no stove. She had no hearth. She had no wood. What she had was a small concave piece of soapstone she had found near the creek bed and spent 2 days carefully shaping with a flat piece of slate and then with Harlan's knife grinding and scraping until she had something that held a depression, a small hollow, a vessel. She had rendered the fat from a rabbit she had snared on the 9th day, the one useful thing she had managed to catch in all her trapping attempts, a small animal that she had caught in a simple loop of stripped bark she had positioned along a run she found by reading the compressed snow where small feet had been traveling regularly. She had melted the fat over a fire she built in the open from dried bark and cattail seed heads, and rendered it carefully and stored it in the hollow of the soapstone. She twisted a small wick from strips of dried moss. She set the wick in the fat. She struck flint against the back of Harlan's knife. The spark caught on the 3rd try. The flame was almost nothing. A small blue and yellow point of light no larger than the tip of a finger wavering in the still air of the dome's interior, so small it seemed almost an argument against itself, seemed to be making the case for its own inadequacy. She watched it. In a cabin in Providence Creek, this flame would have vanished against the scale of the cold, absorbed and dismissed like a word spoken in a large empty room. The cabin's log walls, with their inevitable gaps and their R value that Grandmother Flint had never put a number to, but had understood intuitively to be insufficient, the cabin's roaring hearth that sent 90% of its heat straight up the chimney in its hunger for oxygen, the cabin's door that let in a wall of cold air every time a person moved through it, all of these would have made this small flame irrelevant. But this was not a cabin. The dome above her was 2 feet of compacted snow on every surface, snow that was 95% trapped air, air that could not move and so could not carry heat away from her. Air that sat in the pores of the snow like a patient guardian holding the boundary between inside and outside with a thoroughness that no log wall had ever achieved. In this space, the small flame was not irrelevant. In this space, the small flame was enough. She watched the interior surface of the dome as the minutes passed, watched the way the flame's heat, modest and constant, reached the walls and found them, and began the slow process of persuasion. The snow at the surface of the interior wall softened almost imperceptibly. A thin gloss appeared, caught the light, became something other than snow. A thin layer of ice was forming on the interior surface of the dome, a natural consequence of the snow melting slightly at its surface and then refreezing in the cold interior air of the space between the flame and the wall. Grandmother Flint had told her about this too, had described it as the house learning to wear its own armor. The snow becoming ice, the ice becoming a seal, the seal making the insulation better and the structure stronger. All from the modest output of a flame you could cover with one hand. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with its usual ambitions. Inside the dome, the flame burned without flickering. The air around her was cold enough that she could see her breath, a thin cloud forming and dissipating with each exhalation. But it was not the cold that had been trying to kill her for 10 days. It was the cold of a room that is slightly below comfortable, not the cold of a land that has decided you are an inconvenience it intends to correct. She ate the last of the berries she had gathered that day. She pulled the bark layer around herself on the sleeping platform and lay down. Above her, the dome curved in the dim light of the flame. She could hear the wind. It was not close. It was the sound of something that was happening somewhere else at a remove, the wind running across the surface of the drift above her, the way weather runs across the surface of the sea. When you are below it, an event you are aware of but are not inside. She thought about Grandmother Flint, and not about the words this time, about the hands, about the specific memory of watching those hands move over the snow, shaping and pressing and trimming, doing the thing that they had done so many times before, that the knowing had moved out of the mind and into the muscle, which is the highest form of knowing because it cannot be taken away by fear or cold or grief or the particular exhaustion of 10 days of surviving alone in a Dakota Territory October. She thought about the knife that was in her boot, the knife with the good steel that had come from a man who could not look at her when he delivered her death sentence, because looking at her would have required him to understand what he was doing to a real person, and who had then in the dark before dawn left her a tool because he could not entirely live with what he had done. She thought about that without bitterness. Bitterness was a weight and she had no room for it. She thought about spring, not as a comfort, as a fact. The prairie would be green again in 4 months, which was a long time and a finite time, and finite was the important part. The cold was not permanent. Nothing was permanent. Water understood this better than stone did, which was why her grandmother had said she was made of water. Stone breaks. Water finds another shape. The flame in the soapstone lamp burned on. The dome held. Wyatt closed her eyes. For the first time since the morning she had walked north out of Providence Creek, with one door opening quietly behind her and every other door shut, she was not shivering. Her body, which had been spending its warmth against the cold every moment of every night for 10 days, settled into itself with the slow release of something that has been braced a long time and has been told it can stop. She slept. Outside the Dakota Territory, night did what it always did in late October, which was to become something immense and indifferent, the sky going black and wild with stars at this elevation. The wind moving across the emptiness with the complete freedom of a thing that has nothing to stop it. The cold deepened by degrees through the hours, moving from the cold of evening into the cold of deep night, into the particular cold of the hours before dawn that was something beyond temperature and closer to intention, the cold that has decided. Above the buried dome at Wolf's Jaw, the wind made its customary investigation of every surface, found the curved white shell of the structure, ran across it, found nothing to grab onto. No seam, no gap, no crack, moved on. The ventilation hole breathed. The flame inside burned on. Wyatt slept through all of it, warm enough to dream. Part 2. The Cost of Certainty. November settled over the Dakota Territory the way a judgment settles over a courtroom, completely and without appeal. The sky lost what little color it had kept through October and became a single unvaried expanse of white-gray, the color of iron that has been left out long enough to forget it was ever anything else. The temperature dropped in stages, each stage a distinct announcement, the way a man knocks before he enters, and then enters anyway, regardless of whether you answered. The first stage was the cold that made your breath visible. The second was the cold that made your fingers slow. The third was the cold that made everything slow, that moved into the joints and the muscle and the deep tissue, and set up residence there with the patient ease of something that knows it will not be asked to leave until April. Inside the dome at Wolf's Jaw, none of this was happening. This is the thing that required understanding, the thing that Harlan Stroud had ridden away from, without understanding, the thing that Providence Creek had dismissed with the certainty of people who have never been asked to question their certainties. The cold outside the dome was not the cold inside the dome. These were not two versions of the same thing. They were two entirely different things that happened to share a name. Wyatt understood this not as a theory, but as a daily lived fact, the way you understand the difference between standing in a river and standing on its bank. She woke each morning inside a temperature that was cold, but not killing the specific cold of a space that was being held at a few degrees above freezing by the accumulated effect of her body heat, her breath, and the small, steady flame of the soapstone lamp that she fed with careful measured amounts of rendered fat. The air had a quality to it, a stability that she had not experienced in the 10 days before the dome was complete. It did not move. It did not come from anywhere. It simply existed in the space around her, inert and constant, doing the one thing she needed it to do, which was to be there. Grandmother Flint had explained this to her once, in the particular way she explained physics, which was through the hands and the body, in the example of things immediately present. They had been sitting together inside a completed shelter many winters before the sickness came, and her grandmother had taken a smoldering cattail reed and held it near the floor, and then held it near the ceiling, watching the small thread of smoke, and she had asked Waya what she noticed. Near the floor, the smoke moved toward the entrance tunnel. Near the ceiling, it did not move at all. Her grandmother had nodded. Warm air is lighter, she said. It rises. Cold air is heavy. It falls. You build the place where you sleep as high as possible because the highest place in the room is always the warmest. And you build your door so that it goes down before it goes up, so that the cold air that enters pools at the bottom of the entrance and cannot climb into the place where you live. Waya had been 9 years old. She had not understood it fully then. She understood it now with the specificity of someone who was demonstrating it to herself every night, who woke each morning in the warmest layer of air in the structure on the raised sleeping platform 6 inches above where the cold air settled on the floor, and who could feel with her own body the difference between those 6 inches, the way the temperature changed between the floor and the platform, the way the temperature changes between the deep water and the surface. The log cabins of Providence Creek were built on a different principle entirely, and that principle was losing. She understood this not because she had studied their cabins with a critical eye, but because Grandmother Flint had taught her to see thermal behavior the way a tracker sees footprints as information left in the environment by forces moving through it. She had watched in the 2 years she lived among them the way the settlers' fires consume wood. The massive stone hearths built to dominate the center of the cabin, built to be impressive, built to be the irrefutable statement of humanity's capacity to manufacture warmth in a cold world. She had watched how they roared. She had watched how the heat went upward, always upward, because heat rises in a chimney as a direct invitation to rise. 90% of the generated warmth sent straight out into the sky, while the people who had cut the wood and stacked the wood and fed the wood into the fire sat in the cold edge of the room and pulled their blankets tighter. She had watched how the fire, hungry for oxygen, pulled air toward itself from every direction, which meant pulling cold air in through every crack and gap in the log walls, through the space under the door, through the imperfect seals around the windows, creating a steady manufactured wind inside the cabin, a draft that moved across the floor and across the ankles of the people sitting near the hearth, a draft that the settlers called a cold draft, as if it were a natural occurrence, as if it were not something their own fire was creating. They were not heating their cabins. They were heating a column of air that went straight up the chimney, using the rest of the fire's energy to drag cold air in from outside as fast as it was producing warmth, maintaining a small pocket of tolerable temperature immediately in front of the hearth, and letting the rest of the cabin remain cold, and calling this survival. It was survival. She did not deny this. It worked in the way that bailing a leaking boat works, which is to say it was exhausting and continuous and required enormous ongoing effort. And the moment you stopped, the moment the wood ran out, or the weather got bad enough that you could not get to the woodpile, you were in serious trouble. Her grandmother had called this way of living a war of attrition against an opponent with infinite resources. You cannot win a war of attrition against winter, she had said. Winter does not get tired. Winter does not run out. If you fight it, you will always lose in the end. You must find another way. The dome was the other way. It did not fight winter. It made winter irrelevant. Inside the dome, the cold outside could do whatever it wanted. It could drop to 20 below, to 30 below, to whatever extreme it chose. The 2 feet of compacted snow on every surface, snow that was 95% trapped air, air that could not move and so could not carry heat away, created an insulating barrier that no log wall had ever equaled. The cold was out there. She was in here. The dome was the seam between those 2 facts, and it was a seam that held. She thought about this in the mornings, not as a celebration, but as a review, the way a craftsman reviews their work, before continuing, checking what is holding and what needs attention. The lamp needed fat every few days. She managed this through trapping patient and methodical reading the snow for the compressed trails of rabbits and the larger prints of the occasional mink that worked the creek bank. She was not a skilled trapper. She had been taught the principles, but had never needed to rely on them seriously, and the early attempts failed more than they succeeded. But she learned from each failure in the specific way that you learn from failures, when the alternative to learning is dying, which is completely and without reservation. The ventilation hole needed clearing every few days, particularly after snowfall. She had shaped a thin probe from a straight willow branch, and she pushed it through the hole from inside to ensure it remained open. This was a small maintenance that took less than a minute, and that was she understood as important as any other element of the structure. A sealed space was a dying space. The dome breathed because she kept the hole clear. She kept the hole clear because she understood why it was there. The interior walls continued their slow transformation. Each day, the soapstone lamp burned in the surface of the inner wall, underwent its small cycle of softening and refreezing the thin melt that became the thinner glaze that became the smooth ice that sealed the snow beneath it and made the whole interior surface impermeable and reflective. The dome was getting stronger as she lived in it. It was improving under occupation. She was not simply inhabiting a structure. She was, through the daily fact of her presence and her small fire, curing the structure into something better than what it had been when she completed it. She thought about the settlers' cabins in contrast. Each winter cracked the chinking a little more. Each season of freeze and thaw worked the mud loose between the logs. The cabins degraded with use. They required constant maintenance to hold their integrity, and the maintenance itself created opportunities for failure gaps that were patched imperfectly, seams that were never quite right. The war against the cold left damage that had to be repaired, and the repairs were themselves imperfect, and the imperfections became the entry points for the next winter's assault. Her dome improved with time. The cold was making it better. She was using winter's own nature to strengthen her defense against winter. This was the thing her grandmother had meant. Not a metaphor, not a piece of philosophy, a literal physical fact about the behavior of snow and water and temperature that the skyfolk had understood for generations, and that the people of Providence Creek had never had any reason to learn. The first real test came in the second week of December. She felt it coming 2 days before it arrived, the way she felt all significant weather changes in the pressure of the air, in the behavior of the wind, and the particular quality of the clouds on the northern horizon, which had a density and a speed that told her something substantial was organizing itself up there and would be arriving with intentions. She spent the day before the storm in preparation. She checked every surface of the dome. She packed additional snow into the cold sink entrance, thickening the walls of the tunnel. She rendered additional fat from a rabbit she had caught that morning, filling the soapstone lamp to its capacity. She gathered dry bark and moss from her small cache and arranged it within reach. She did everything she could do, and then she sat on the sleeping platform and ate a careful meal of dried meat and berries and waited. The storm arrived in the middle of the night. She heard it before she felt it, a change in the sound that the dome made, the ambient presence of wind outside shifting from its usual low register into something higher and more insistent. Then the sound deepened as the snow began to fall heavy and consistent, adding itself to the exterior of the dome in layers that she could track by the slight change in the quality of the silence inside, the way the sound of the outside world was being steadily muffled, wrapped in additional insulation by the storm's own deposit. The wind increased through the hours. By midnight, by her estimation, it was screaming across the prairie above her. She could hear it the way you hear something at a remove, a filtered version of its actual ferocity, the dome reducing it to an ambient presence that had no power inside the space she occupied. The temperature outside was dropping. She knew this not because she could feel it in any direct way, but because she could hear it in the way the wind behaved, the way certain pitches appeared in its register that she had learned to associate with significant cold. Inside the dome, the temperature did not change. This was the part that was difficult to explain in words to people who had not experienced it. The temperature inside the dome was not comfortable in any absolute sense. It was cold in there. You could see your breath. Your fingers needed to move regularly to stay useful. But it was a cold that did not move, a cold that was not trying to get anywhere, a cold that was simply present in a room that was holding it at a fixed level and refusing to let it go further. It was survivable cold. On the other side of 2 feet of compacted snow, outside in the dark, the temperature was dropping below 20 below zero, and the wind was ensuring that the effective temperature was considerably worse than the number suggested. She tended the lamp and slept and woke and tended the lamp again. The storm lasted 3 days. When it was over, she pushed through the entrance tunnel and emerged into a landscape that had been rearranged. The drifts at Wolf's Jaw had doubled in some places, the wind having sculpted the new snow into shapes that bore no relation to the terrain she had been navigating for 6 weeks. Her igloo was buried under additional feet of fresh accumulation, transformed from a visible structure into simply another drift indistinguishable from the natural formations around it. The ventilation hole still breathed. She stood on the surface of the new snow and looked south toward Providence Creek. From this distance, she could see smoke rising, which meant the settlement had survived the storm, which meant Harlan Stroud's log cabins had done their job, which was the minimum job, which was to keep the people inside them alive through a storm that would have killed them in the open. What she could also see from the quality of the smoke, from the volume of it, from the way it poured rather than drifted, was that the fires in Providence Creek were burning very hot. Burning with the urgency of fires that are being fed faster than planned. Burning with the desperation of fires that were the only thing standing between the people around them and the cold that had just demonstrated what it was capable of. The wood piles were down. She did not know this as a fact. She knew it as a logical inference from what she could observe. A 3-day storm at temperatures that required constant fire management at maximum output would consume wood at a rate that no winter plan had accounted for, because no winter plan accounted for maximum output sustained for 72 hours. The settlers would have come through the storm, but they would have come through it, damaged their reserves, reduced to a fraction of what they had been before, their margin for error between now and spring compressed to something very thin. She noted this. She went back inside and tended her lamp and ate carefully and thought about what the winter still had in front of it. The man came on the 18th of December. Not Harlan Stroud, not a trapper, not anyone she had expected. She heard the approach from inside the dome, the crunch of steps on the surface snow that had a particular lightness to it, not the heavy, deliberate tread of an adult, but the quicker, more random footfall of someone younger. Someone who was moving with the particular energy of a person who is doing something they have decided not to think too hard about, because thinking too hard about it might result in not doing it. She sat very still and listened to the footsteps stop outside the entrance tunnel. A long pause. Then a voice not quite steady aimed at the tunnel opening. Hello, it was Clem Stroud. She knew his voice. 2 years in a settlement of less than 100 people had given her a complete catalog of every voice in it, the way you develop a catalog of voices when you are always on the outside of conversations, rather than inside them when you hear, rather than participate when listening is your primary relationship to the community you are nominally a part of. Clem Stroud was 12 years old and had his father's jaw and his father's directness, and he asked questions that other people in the settlement had apparently decided were impolite or impractical or both. He was the one who had asked why she would build something if she wanted to die. She heard him shift his weight outside the entrance. She heard his breathing slightly elevated, the breathing of someone who has been walking hard and is also experiencing some version of the particular alertness that comes when you are doing something you are not sure is a good idea. Come in, she said. A pause. Then the sound of him getting on his hands and knees and beginning to navigate the entrance tunnel, which required an adult to crawl and required a 12-year-old to make a different kind of compromise between their height and the tunnel's dimensions, a negotiation she could hear in the scrapings and adjustments of his progress through the cold sink section. Then his head appeared above the level of the floor. He pulled himself up and stood and stopped. She watched his face go through the thing that every face would go through when first entering this space, the recalibration that was required when the body's expectation formed from everything it had ever learned about cold and snow, and the relationship between the two, met the actual temperature and quality of the air inside the dome, and found the expectation to be wrong in every particular. It was not warm by the standard of a heated room, but it was warm by the standard of everything outside the dome, by the standard of what it should have been in a structure built from the material that represented cold itself, by the standard of what his body had been bracing against since he left the settlement. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the small flame of the soapstone lamp, which cast its modest light across the smooth ice of the interior surface and made the whole dome glow with a diffused amber quality, the light not coming from one point but from everywhere, filtered through ice and snow until it was something other than light, in the ordinary sense, something closer to the light inside a cloud. His breath made a small cloud in front of him. He reached out and put his hand against the inner wall. She watched him do this, watched his expression change when he felt the surface, which was smooth and solid and not cold in the way he had expected, not the biting cold of touching snow or ice in the open air, but the neutral cool of a surface that was holding itself at a fixed temperature, not taking heat from his hand, not stealing anything from him. This is like being inside the sun, he said. It was not an accurate description scientifically, but it was accurate in the way that a child is accurate, which is in the most important sense, which is the sense of what something feels like when you are inside it. She did not correct him. She moved to give him room on the sleeping platform, and he sat keeping his hand against the wall for a moment longer before letting go. He did not ask her questions immediately. He sat in and looked at the dome and breathed the air, and she watched him do what the space did to people when it was given time to do it, which was to slow them down, to take the urgency out of them, to replace the constant defensive alertness of surviving a Dakota winter in a log cabin with something that was not quite its opposite, but was something that log cabin life did not easily permit, which was stillness. After a while, he said, "My father thinks you're dead." She said, "I know." He turned and looked at her. His eyes had his father's quality of directness, but without his father's certainty. They were the eyes of someone who is still assembling their certainties, who has not yet decided what they know. "Does it bother you?" he asked. She thought about this. "No," she said. Being thought dead is a kind of privacy. He considered this with the seriousness that 12-year-olds bring to things they are trying to add to their understanding of the world. He stayed for an hour. He asked about the lamp, about what it burned, and how long the fat lasted. She told him. He asked about the entrance tunnel, why it went down before it went up. She explained about the cold sink, about the weight of cold air, about the way the warm air in the dome sat above it and could not be displaced as long as the geometry of the entrance was correct. He listened with the specific attention of a boy who is learning a thing that has immediate practical application, which is different from and more complete than the attention of a boy who is learning a thing or an examination. Before he left, he looked around the dome one more time. "It's better than home," he said. He said it not as a complaint about his father's cabin, but as a simple observation, the way you note that one road is faster than another, as a fact about the world that has just been added to your inventory of facts. She did not agree or disagree. He navigated back through the entrance tunnel, and his footsteps receded north toward the settlement. She listened to them go. She thought about what he would do with what he had seen. She thought about the difference between knowledge and the willingness to act on knowledge, which was not the same difference in everyone, and was a particularly complicated difference in the son of a man whose entire authority rested on being certain about things, on being the person in the settlement who knew how things should be done, and had demonstrated that knowledge by building the structures that kept the settlement alive. What Clem had seen in the dome was a challenge to every cabin his father had ever built. She understood this. She was not certain he understood it yet, but she thought he would. She was right, though it came sooner and harder than she had anticipated. Harlan Stroud found the Brower family on the 23rd of December. There was no dramatic discovery, no storm, no unusual cold. The temperature on the night of the 22nd had been severe, well below zero. But this was not exceptional, not by Dakota standards, not by the standard of what the winter had already demonstrated it was capable of. It was simply a cold night, the kind that happened regularly between November and March, and that the settlement had always managed because they had fires and they had wood, and they understood that the fires needed to be maintained and the wood needed to be sufficient. The Brower cabin was the oldest in the settlement. Samuel Brower had built it in the first year of the settlement's existence, before Harlan had developed the techniques he had since refined, and it showed its age in the way old buildings show their age, in the particular settling of the structure, the way the logs had shifted slightly from their original positions over 10 years of freeze and thaw, the way the chinking had been repaired so many times that it was a record of repairs more than a continuous seal, the way the door no longer sat quite straight in its frame. It was also the cabin with the smallest woodpile. Samuel Brower had been sick in October. The coughing sickness, not the kind that killed, but the kind that took a month from a man's life, took his energy and his capacity for physical labor at precisely the time when that capacity was most required for building the winter's wood supply. His wife Marta had done what she could. Their two children, 7 and 9, had helped in the way that 7 and 9-year-olds help, which was earnestly and with limited effectiveness. They had not been short enough that Harlan had felt the need to supplement their pile directly. They had been short enough that the margin was thin. The December storm had consumed that margin. Harlan went to check on them because he went to check on every household, every few days, a practice he had maintained since the settlement's first winter, his version of responsibility, the caretaking that was the other side of his authority. He knocked on their door at mid-morning, no answer. He opened the door. The fire was out. This was not in itself definitive. Fires went out. Fires went out at night when people were tired and slept through the moment when another log was needed, and then they woke cold and rebuilt the fire and were reminded of why you did not let the fire go out. But the fire had been out for hours. The interior of the cabin was at the temperature of the outside air. The water in the bucket near the hearth was frozen solid. Samuel and Marta Brower and their two children were under their blankets in the positions of people who had gone to sleep cold and pulled everything they had over themselves to try to stay warm. They were not warm. Harlan stood in the doorway of the Brower cabin for a long time. He was not a man who expressed the things that happened inside him in visible ways. He had learned this suppression in the same way he had learned everything else through the practical education of a hard life that required a certain kind of steadiness, the steadiness of a man who other people look to when things go wrong, who cannot afford to be visibly broken by the things that break him, because being visibly broken would break the people looking at him. He stood in the doorway, and he was as still as the cold in the room, and he looked at the four shapes under the blankets, and he understood something that he had not wanted to understand. He had built this cabin. He had built it the way he built every cabin, the way that was correct, the way that worked, the way his knowledge told him was sufficient. He had built every cabin in Providence Creek on the same principles, log and chink and stone. Hearth and the management of fire, and those cabins were housing the settlement's people through a Dakota winter, and that was what a shelter was supposed to do, and the principle was sound. The principle had always been sound, but the principle required wood. The principle required a continuous supply of wood at a rate that scaled with the severity of the cold, and in a severe winter, in a December storm that lasted 3 days and required maximum fire output for 72 consecutive hours, the wood supply had to be sufficient for maximum output for 72 consecutive hours, and the Brower woodpile had not been. This was not a failure of the principle, the part of his mind that had been built on certainty said. This was a failure of execution. This was an anomaly. Samuel Brower had been sick, the woodpile was short, the margin was thin. It was a specific set of circumstances. It was not a comment on the fundamental approach. But the other part of his mind, the part that was standing in a room where 4 people were dead in their beds, was not interested in the argument. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to do what needed to be done. Clem told him about the igloo that evening. He had been keeping it since his visit, which was several days, which was a kind of discipline. For a 12-year-old, the discipline of sitting on knowledge that you are not sure what to do with, waiting for the moment when not saying it becomes more wrong than saying it. The death of the Brower family was that moment. He told his father about the entrance tunnel in the coal sink, about the sleeping platform and why it was raised, about the small lamp that heated the whole space because there was no draft to steal the heat, about the ice forming on the interior walls from the cycle of melt and refreeze the dome improving itself over time, about the temperature inside which was cold, but was a cold that did not move and did not take anything from you. Harlan listened. He sat in front of his own hearth, which was burning at its usual rate, which was consuming wood at its usual rate, which was the rate that had always seemed necessary, and was now looking in the light of what his son was describing, like a rate that was substantially higher than it needed to be. He asked one question. He asked it the way a man asks a question when he already knows the answer but needs to hear it from somewhere outside himself to accept it. "It's really warmer than here," he said. Clem met his father's eyes, warmer and quieter, and the walls don't make any sound. "When the wind blows," Clem said, It's like the storm can't find it. Harlan sat with this for a long time. He sat with the Brower family, with the image that he was going to be sitting with for a long time, regardless of what else he thought about the four shapes under the blankets in the cold room. He sat with 2 winters ago, when he had told a girl who had no people left that the wild would test her, and had looked at the sky when he said it, because looking at the sky was easier than looking at her. He sat with the fact that the girl he had given to the cold was the only person in the Dakota Territory who was not burning through her wood supply at a catastrophic rate because she had no wood supply. She had a soapstone lamp and rendered rabbit fat and 2 feet of compacted snow, and she was warmer and quieter, and the storm couldn't find her. He stood up and began putting on his coat. It was dark. It was too dark to go anywhere. The temperature had dropped with the setting of the sun and was heading toward the numbers that turned the air into something that bit at exposed skin and found its way through wool, with a directness that made you understand the wool was an argument, not a fact. He sat back down. Clem watched him. He said nothing to his son. He looked at the fire, which was eating the wood at its usual relentless rate, and he thought about what it would mean to go to that dome and say the thing he was already, in some interior way, he was not ready to acknowledge to himself, already knowing he would need to say. He sat with the fire until it needed another log. He put the log in. He went to bed. He did not sleep. The days between Clem's revelation and the 12th of January were the strange days, the days with a quality that Waya would later try to describe and find herself unable to describe fully, the quality of a landscape that has gone very still before something large moves through it. The cold continued. The sky remained its unvaried gray-white, the color of certainty, that has been worn down to something less than certainty, but has not yet decided what to become. The settlement managed. Harlan did his rounds. He made note of the wood piles. He noted which ones were lower than planned and began the arithmetic of what was left of the winter and what was left of the wood and where the gap was. There was a gap. There was always going to be a gap. The December storm had taken what it took, and what it took was not replaceable. The trees close enough to the settlement to be harvested without a full day's expedition had been heavily worked for 10 years, and what remained was the harder work, the further trips, the heavier loads, the days when the cold made prolonged outdoor labor into its own kind of threat. The gap would need to be managed. He had managed gaps before. He had always managed gaps before. He was Harlan Stroud, and he had built every structure in the settlement, and he had led it through hard winters and harder springs, and he would manage this gap as he had managed every other difficulty that the frontier presented, with the tools he had and the knowledge he possessed and the certainty that had always so far been sufficient. So far. He went to see Waya on the 10th of January. He did not tell Clem. He did not tell anyone. He saddled his horse in the early morning before the settlement was moving, and he rode north under a sky that had that morning acquired an unusual quality, a strange luminous warmth from the south that felt like a distraction, felt too soft and too present, felt like the way a conversation feels when the person you're talking to is being very pleasant because they are about to tell you something unpleasant. He arrived at Wolf's Jaw and looked at the landscape, and as before found nothing where he expected to find something, no visible structure, just the drifts and the shapes the wind had made over the past weeks, the anonymous white hills of an accumulated winter. Then he found the ventilation hole. He recognized it because Clem had described it, the thin, steady thread of vapor rising from the crown of the largest drift, so subtle that you could mistake it for a trick of the morning light, a shimmer in the cold air. Nothing more. He stood and looked at it for a long moment and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a precise name for. He walked to the drift and found the entrance tunnel and got on his hands and knees in the snow and called her name. Waya. A pause, then the sound of movement inside. He crawled in. The cold section of the tunnel was expected. This was snow, and he was inside it, and it was cold. That was a rational state of affairs that confirmed what his body had been prepared for. He moved forward on his hands and knees and descended slightly, and then began to rise, and the air around him changed. He came up into the dome. He stood up straight, his head close to, but not touching the curved ceiling, and he was in a place that should not have existed, that violated the principles he had organized, his entire understanding of winter survival around, that was impossible by the logic of everything he had built his life's knowledge on. It was not warm, it was cold. But it was a cold that was not doing anything to him. It was a wound that was simply present, that was not moving, that was not hunting him, that was not following the logic of cold as he understood it, which was that cold was always trying to get in, that cold was always looking for the way, through that cold never stopped. This cold had stopped. He stood in the diffused amber light of the soapstone lamp, and he put his hand against the ice-glazed inner wall of the dome, and he felt the surface which was smooth and neutral under his palm, which was not pulling the warmth from his hand, the way every cold surface he had ever touched pulled warmth from him, which was holding itself at a temperature that was not trying to be his temperature and was not trying to take his temperature, which was just there. Waya was sitting on the sleeping platform with her knees pulled up watching him. She had the look of someone who has been watching something for a long time and has been waiting to see how it would resolve. He looked around the dome. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the sleeping platform and understood immediately and physically why it was raised, felt the warmth of the higher air as distinct from the cooler air at the level of the floor, a difference of perhaps 5 feet, translating into a difference that his body registered clearly. He looked at the small hole at the top of the dome and understood with a completeness that arrived all at once, rather than in stages, why it was there. He was standing in a structure that was teaching him everything he had gotten wrong. Not one thing, everything. The chinking that he repaired every fall and that opened up again every spring, the fireplace that sent 90% of its heat up the chimney, the door that let in a wall of cold every time it opened, the logs that settled and shifted and required constant maintenance, the wood pile that was never quite enough, the 4 shapes under the blankets in the Brower cabin, all of it, the whole architecture of his knowledge and his authority and his certainty was present in this small, cold, warm space and was visible for the first time as something other than the only way. He sank to his knees on the floor beside the sleeping platform. He was not a man who performed gestures. He was not a man who made the physical expressions of interior states, who used his body to communicate what was happening inside him. This was not a performance. It was simply that his legs stopped holding him up in the usual way. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he took his hands away and looked at her. She was watching him with eyes that had no triumph in them. He had half expected triumph. He would have understood triumph. He had condemned her to the winter, and she had survived the winter, and he had come looking for her and found her in a structure that made everything he had built look insufficient. He would have understood triumph. But her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been waiting for someone to arrive and is simply glad they have finally arrived and is ready now to do the work that their arrival makes possible. He said the only 2 words he had left, "Teach me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The first thing to understand is that you are not fighting it. You have never been fighting it. You have been losing a fight that you never had to start." Outside the Dakota Territory, Sky was doing something that it had not done in weeks, which was to allow light through in a direct way, a flat winter light from the south that made the snow bright and the air clear and the shadows very sharp. It was beautiful in the way that certain mornings in the depths of a hard winter are beautiful, the beauty of a world stripped to its essentials. It was also to anyone who knew how to read the sky a warning. The temperature had risen several degrees from the previous day, which should not happen in the 2nd week of January, which was wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when the mechanism that produces them is not operating normally. The warmth from the south had a pressure to it, a temporary displacement that had the quality of a held breath of a pause before a sentence. Waya felt it as Harlan was pulling himself back through the entrance tunnel, felt the change in the pressure of the air inside the dome, felt it in the same place in her body where she had always felt significant weather somewhere between the chest and the stomach, a register that had no name in the language of the settlers, but that Grandmother Flint had named long ago with a word that translated approximately as the place where the sky speaks to the body. She came out of the tunnel after him and stood on the surface of the drift and looked south. The sky in that direction was clear and pale, and the warmth coming from it was real, a physical presence against her face, and she understood it for what it was, which was a displacement, which was the weather equivalent of the moment before a pendulum reverses the brief pause at the top of the swing when everything has stopped before it begins again in the opposite direction with the full force of its accumulated travel. Harlan was standing beside his horse preparing to mount. She said, "Do not go far tomorrow." He looked at her. She looked at the southern sky. Something is coming, she said, from the north. It is using the warm air to hide itself. She paused. When the warmth goes, the thing behind it will arrive very fast. Tell your people not to go far from their doors. He looked at the sky. He saw what she saw, which was warmth and light, and the suggestion of spring arriving 6 weeks too early. He did not see what she saw, which was the displacement, the held breath, the pendulum at the top of its swing. He was not yet fluent in what she could read. But he had been in her dome, and he had felt the thing his hands told him about her walls. And he had said, "Teach me," and that meant something. And so he looked at the southern sky, and he looked at her, and he said, "How bad?" She looked at the northern horizon, where the sky was still. Its ordinary pale gray, where nothing was yet visible, where the thing that was coming was still too far away to see. She said, "Worse than anything you have seen here." He mounted and rode south toward Providence Creek. She watched him go until he was small against the landscape, and then she went back in pod and attended to every element of the dome with a care and thoroughness that she had not applied since the night before the December storm. She packed additional snow around the base of the entrance tunnel. She filled the soapstone lamp to its absolute capacity. She checked the ventilation hole, cleared it, checked it again. She arranged her provisions on the sleeping platform in an order that would allow her to reach them in the dark. She checked every seam of the dome's interior, running her hands across the ice surface, looking for any place where the glazing was incomplete, any spot where the insulation was thinner than it should be. She did all of this, and then she sat on the sleeping platform, and she was still. Tomorrow, the children of Providence Creek would run outside in the unusual warmth, because children run outside when the cold relents, because that is what children do, because they cannot read what she could read in the sky, because nobody had taught them. She sat with this. She could not teach an entire settlement the language of weather in one day. She could not give them years of accumulated knowledge in a single afternoon. She could not undo what the winter still had in front of it. What she could do was what she had done. She had built a place that would hold. The lamp burned in the dome, and the dome held the warmth. And outside, the world was still and pale and warm, with a warmth that was not warmth at all, but the shape of the cold arranging itself for its largest statement. And Waya sat in the stillness and waited, because waiting was what the moment required, and she had always known how to find the shape that fit the moment.